Hello, I wanted to try something a little bit different, get myself on camera, maybe give myself my own thoughts on different things throughout baseball. Maybe I'll continue this being a thing where I talk about the goings on as a Major League Baseball. I figure this is a good time to start making a video because the essence of what I'm trying to capture is what being a fan of baseball is like the unique experiences that fans actually have. Um, I just want to capture that feeling, and what I'm about to talk about is honestly my experience with one of my favorite all-time baseball players, who led me to be a fan of the team that I support, which is the Chicago Cubs. Um, I'll kind of just get started with that. So essentially, uh, who I'm talking about is Sammy Sosa, who yesterday more or less came out and apologized for using steroids. He didn't exactly say that. It was a little bit more cryptic, but essentially, this is what he did say. He said, I left it all on the field for the Cubs and the Cubs fans because I wanted to win and make the fans happy. I love to see the fans at Wrigley and right field bleachers every home game. I understand why some players in my era don't always get the recognition that their stats deserve. There were times I did whatever I could to recover from injuries in an effort to keep my strength up and to perform over 162 games. I never broke any laws, but in hindsight, I made mistakes and I apologize. We accomplished great things as a team, and I worked extremely hard in the batting cages to become a great hitter. Cubs fans are the best in the world, and I hope that fans, the Cubs, and I can all come together and move forward. We can't change the past, but the future is bright in my heart. I've always been a Cubs, and I can't wait to see the Cubs fans again. So it seems like he's basically insinuating that he used some sort of performance enhancing drugs to help recover from injuries. I've always kind of suspected if that he did do it, but he did it in a way that took advantage of uh, the vague way that the Major League Baseball kind of banned steroids at the time, which is essentially they're illegal, but there's no testing or anything like that. And my if I remember right, and I used to look into this a little bit more, but I remember the rule essentially stated that players couldn't use illegal drugs. So it never really even said they couldn't use steroids, just that drugs that were not legal, and steroids happen to be illegal in the United States. But at the time, and again, I could be murky on this, um, at the time, steroids were legal in the Dominican, where Sammy Sosa's from. So I've always kind of suspected that he did do these. He did do performance enhancing drugs. He did do steroids. He did whatever you want to call it. But it was in the Dominican, maybe in the off season, maybe at a time he wasn't doing it in the United States. Essentially, he probably wasn't doing it during the season. I don't know, obviously, and he technically wasn't breaking any laws, wasn't breaking any rules, um, which you could argue isn't obviously okay. But in my eyes, I'm like, with the murky way the rules were back in the day, it kind of made me more sympathetic to him. Now, I've always been a Sammy Sosa fan. Like, I became a Cubs fan in 1998 when the big home run chase between Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire occurred. And I'll kind of go into that a little bit. So, Sammy Sosa, or let me get started. So, my fan experience. So, when I was a little kid, I've always loved the game of baseball. When I was born, I have to imagine, like, actually, the first thing that came to my mouth was something along the lines of telling my telling somebody to change the channel because I was watching a game. It was a little bit more profane than that, but that was actually tied with football. And my parents said I could match the logos for football teams with their names at a very young age. But baseball is, and I always like football too, but like baseball is something I really, really gravitated towards. I remember having memories. Some of my earliest memories are me playing wiffle ball in my backyard. I would try to pitch to myself. I would go to the mound and I would throw the ball and I would try to race to the plate and hit the ball that I was throwing. Obviously, it was impossible. Even though I was 3 or 4, I still couldn't outrun a throw that I had. But I wanted to simulate baseball out there. And those are my earliest memories. So basically, what that means to me is the game of baseball predates my memories. So I've always loved the game of baseball. And with that, I never really had a favorite team. For many, many years, I would essentially follow, I don't know, different things that were going on. Like, for example, like if there was a team that I had, I probably would have claimed the New York Yankees because my dad was a Yankees fan, and I'm told my grandpa was a Yankees fan, although to be honest, I never saw evidence of him caring about sports. But I'm told that my dad and his brothers were Yankees fans because of that. Now, they grew up in rural Iowa, um, so in some ways that doesn't make any sense, but it would make sense if my grandfather followed the Yankees because that would have been somewhat close to the time of Ruth. It would have been the time when the Yankees were world famous. Iowa doesn't have any major league sports teams, and who knows how accessible any teams were in rural Iowa in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s. So I could easily see someone picking up the Yankees. I told the Cardinals were popular then. The Cubs probably were because I know they were successful, but the reality is he never really talked about it. I'd never heard the words come out of his mouth that he's a Yankees fan, but my dad said it, my uncle said it, so it must have been true. I just never saw evidence that he liked sports, to be quite honest. But my dad's brothers did, and I know for a fact my dad, when I was a kid, was a Yankees fan. Now he was a Don Mattingly fan, I believe. If he watches this, he'll probably correct me, but um, that's what I remember. I remember my dad watching Don Mattingly, the Yankees. I know the Yankees of the 80s and 90s don't have the success of some of the earlier Yankees teams and some of the later ones too. So he was kind of a fan during a down period for the Yankees, although I do think they won a pennant in the early 80s. But either way, I remember my dad watching the Yankees. I remember him being a Yankees fan. I remember whenever I saw Yankees cards when we'd go to the store and buy cards, my dad wanted the Yankees cards. So I gravitated towards them too. I remember I had a little Yankees jersey that I would wear. It was like a pullover jersey. I have no idea where it came from. The first team I ever saw in a major league park was the New York Yankees. That was in 1990 between them and the Indians. So I've always kind of gravitated towards the Yankees as a little kid, just because that's what I was around. Um, but I wasn't like a hardcore fan of the Yankees because the Yankees games weren't on TV. The only games that were on TV were the Chicago Cubs and Atlanta Braves. They were on all the time, and then your game of the week on Saturday, um, ESPN Sunday Night Baseball, Wednesday Night Baseball, things like that. So you could see the other teams play. But in terms of following a season and following a team every single day, I couldn't do it with the New York Yankees. I don't even think I cared enough to. I was a child. I just liked whenever there was a baseball game on, I wanted to watch it. Or if we're going somewhere on vacation or whatever, I wanted to go see a baseball game, whether it be minor league, major league, didn't matter. It was something that I wanted to see. So as a kid, I did gravitate towards certain teams, and they were for different reasons. I remember very specifically liking the Florida Marlins when they first started because they were unique, honestly. It was the teal color. I love the teal that they used to have, and I really, really did like the Florida Marlins um, quite a bit, even up to the 97 season when they won the World Series. I like the Florida Marlins, which is kind of ironic considering what they did to the Cubs in 2003 when I was a very big Cubs fan. But I loved the Florida Marlins as a little kid. I remember I wrote a story when I was in kindergarten about the Florida Marlins, first game against the Los Angeles Dodgers. So I remember them playing that game. I watched it on ESPN. It was 1993, I believe. The Marlins won. I just remember that, and I remember going to my backyard immediately after and playing wiffle ball and playing out the Florida Marlins against the Los Angeles Dodgers. So I liked them at one point. Um, you could even argue that I claimed the Dodgers as one team, or the not the Dodgers, but the Marlins as one team, and the Yankees as another, like because National League and American League. There's other teams that I liked in there too. I remember liking the Pittsburgh Pirates because my T-ball team was called the Pirates. So I remember for a little bit of time I was like, I like the Pirates. I remember liking the Cubs because they would be on when you came home from school, and Harry Carey would be broadcasting the game, and I loved to watch Harry Carey. I thought he was fun. I thought it was fun to watch a Cubs game, but you also kind of knew they weren't very good, and they didn't really have the reputation of like the cool team because they just weren't very good. In fact, I think a lot of people my age gravitated towards other teams like the White Sox, with Frank Thomas, Robin Ventura, like other guys. They just weren't on TV as much as the Cubs, and I think you had to have a special channel at the time to watch the White Sox, which is probably why they never took off like the Cubs in terms of popularity. But I think amongst my friends or amongst kids that I knew at the time in the early 90s, the White Sox were a way cooler team than the Cubs. The Cubs were just more accessible. Um, so I think I liked the White Sox a little bit, but you just couldn't watch them on TV. So I just never did. I never took to the White Sox. I also remember teams really loving the Seattle Mariners because King Griffey Jr. especially, but some of the other players on those teams that were fun and exciting. The St. Louis Cardinals also had they were popular too, mostly because they were actually a decent Midwest team. Although in the early '90s they weren't really like completely dominant or great, but they'd have a couple playoff teams in the mid '90s, I believe. So it was just a weird time where I just saw all these teams. I didn't really have one that I completely clicked on, latched onto, because I truly think that baseball is it's a 162 game experience, and that was just not something I was ready for as a kid. I just love the game in and of itself. But when you get older, it's a longer, drawn out, more experience, and I just wasn't there. Um, I'd also remember liking the Colorado Rockies because we went and saw them play a game in like 1994 at at it was before it was Coors Field. They played at Mile High Stadium, so I went and saw them play. And I for there was a lump of time where I said I like the Colorado Rockies. Maybe they're my favorite team. I just didn't have a favorite team. I had many teams that I liked. And then you go up, move into 1996. I remember very distinctly in that World Series when the Braves played the Yankees. I rooted very hard for the Yankees. I might have at that point gone, I am a Yankees fan. This is my team. And I remember that World Series. I remember that World Series very fondly. I very much remember, I believe it was game 4 or 5. For some reason, the actual game's blanking on me. It was when the Yankees came back from 6-0 down. Jim Leyritz hits a 3-run homer off Mark Wohlers to tie the game, and the Yankees end up winning in extra innings. I even remember Joe Buck's call to tie game, and I didn't even watch the game live because I would have been 10 years old. My dad would have made me go to sleep. But I know for a fact he recorded the game on VHS. And I heard about what happened the next day, and of course I wanted to watch that game because a 6-0 comeback in the World Series is absolutely crazy, and I had to watch it. And to this day, it's one of my favorite baseball games because that was the game that kind of turned the series around, and the Yankees ended up winning the World Series. And I did latch on to at least that World Series, maybe the playoffs. No, I remember the playoffs too. So I did latch on to the Yankees team in the postseason, but because I lived in Iowa and there was no MLB TV then, nothing like that made maybe there might have been some sort of satellite package where you could watch them, but my parents weren't paying for that and I was 10. So it just you watch what you watch. So I didn't stick with the Yankees the next year in 1997. I just didn't do it. 1997, I don't remember distinctly like following this regular season that closely. You kind of follow the news stories and you know what's happening even at that age. But I think again it was that playoffs where I again started to latch on to a different team, and that was when the Florida Marlins were there. Now remember, I liked the Florida Marlins when they first started, so I latched onto that team in the playoffs. I remember their whole playoff run when they beat uh, the Atlanta Braves. I remember them doing the fake tomahawk chop in the crowd. I remember just different things about that series. I remember Livan Hernandez kind of becoming a rookie phenom at the time, which is funny because he ended up pitching for a long time and being a pretty good pitcher. But I remember that Marlins team making their run, going to the World Series. I remember my dad let me stay up late to watch Game 7 of that World Series where Edgar Echeverria hits the base hit against the Cleveland Indians, which is also ironic because they end up being the team the Cubs beat again in a Game 7 about 20 years later, 19 years later. But I stuck with that team. I was excited for the Marlins. I was very happy when they won the World Series. So for 2 years in a row, the team that I liked the most won the World Series. Uh, so I guess you could argue that I'm not a long-suffering Cubs fan because I had that experience, but I never really agree with that because I didn't follow those teams through a whole season, and I kind of just let them go once the year ended. The big reason I gave up on the Marlins, again, same thing. There's no Florida Marlins games on TV in the Midwest. That's just not a thing to show. Unless they're playing the Cubs, you could see them on WGN. But the Marlins also had their big sell-off the next year where they won the World Series, and the next year they weren't expected to be any good, and they weren't. And you knew it. even I knew it as a kid. I knew it as 11-year-old. I remember very distinctly watching the first matchup between the Chicago Cubs and the Florida Marlins on WGN. They're trying to hype the game, but they don't really hype the game. It was basically Steve Stone talking about how this team just sold off all their players, and he knew they weren't going to be very good, and it was just really, really difficult to get into that. So I didn't stick with the Florida Marlins. I I don't really know who I liked. I'm sorry, I'm talking about 1998. I guess this is kind of the early matchup there, but either way, like knew they were selling it off, and again, I just didn't have a team to stick with. So going back to some of those opening sequences when they're talking about these teams in 1998, I remember very, very distinctly in April, and I believe the Cubs actually started their season against the Florida Marlins, which is interesting. And watching that game, knowing the Marlins had their sell off and they weren't going to be competitive. And the Cubs announcers were hyping their team. Now, this is probably a thing they did every single year. Like the Cubs' famous saying is, wait till next year. So, this is probably just early season optimism where Steve Stone is talking about the club and hyping the team. And then also, like, this was the first year after Harry Carey died. And so there was just intrigue on what's Chip Carey going to be like because his grandson's taking over. And I remember Chip Carey from like Fox broadcast doing like the broadcast shows in between. So I guess there's a curiosity to be like, oh, well, he's doing the broadcasting now, so I want to watch this without Harry. Although for a while Harry wasn't doing road games anyway, so it wasn't too weird to see Harry Carey not on the road. But there was still that knowledge of he's not here. Um, so I remember the general curiosity of just watching opening day between the Cubs and the Marlins, and I think Henry Rodriguez hit a home run, or it doesn't really matter, but I remember him homering or somebody homering, the Cubs taking the lead, and I think it was Steve Stone being like, "This team's different this year. This is why this team's different. This team's going to make a run at it. They're going to be very good." And in retrospect, that was probably weird because the 1998 Cubs, now they do end up being a good team. They make the playoffs, but I think it was they kind of came out of nowhere. Um, So I don't know exactly what it was. Also, Kerry Wood was on the 1998 Cubs. He, at the time, that was his rookie year, and he was a rookie phenom, much in the same way of like a Paul Skeens is nowadays. And I remember hearing about Kerry Wood. I remember I think it was my sixth grade teacher, was a big Cubs fan, and he was hyping Kerry Wood in class. He was like, Kerry Wood, this guy's going to be a great pitcher. Like, he's the guy who's going to lead the Cubs, all this stuff. And I remember, like, okay, Kerry Wood, so you heard his name, but I don't think he was actually called up to the team yet in 1998. But there was a little bit of hype on this 1998 Cubs team. So I had intrigue, and I was like, if they're supposed to be good this year, I do want to watch the Cubs. The Cubs are never good. I would like to watch a good Cubs team. I think that's cool. They're on every single day. They're on WGN. Like I come home from school, they play day games, they're on constantly. I want to watch the Cubs be good. And I've always liked the Cubs. I always liked the Cubs even before they were my team. They just weren't my number one team because they weren't cool or they didn't have the same intrigue for me as the Yankees or the Marlins, and I didn't have that connection to them. But there was just a general curiosity with that team. I remember a little bit later, it was the Cubs' first home game after Harry Carey died, and I remember very distinctly the tribute to Harry Carey, and I remember that being very moving and touching. And I grew up with Harry Carey, granted the very old version, who probably had a lot of drinks and I believe had had his stroke, so there was definitely some cognitive issues there with him broadcasting. But I remember very distinctly loving Harry Carey as a kid, which is one of the reasons why I like the Cubs, even though I knew they were never any good. So I remember watching, and I think I must have come home from school right when it started. Maybe that was an early release. I don't know exactly why, but somehow I was able to watch the entire ceremony uh, with Harry Carey, or maybe they went back and showed highlights of the beginning, and what I'm remembering is actually when Harry Carey's wife sang the seventh inning stretch. I don't know exactly the timeline. I just remember very distinctly that day when they're honoring Harry Carey. Um, I believe they were playing the Montreal Expos, but I could be wrong. I'd have to relook at the schedule to know exactly who they were playing. But I remember that opening day just being very. It was emotional. It was like Harry Carey's gone, like one of the greatest broadcasters of all time, and one of my favorites. Even at 12, like I had a favorite broadcaster, and now he's gone. And will Cubs games even be fun to watch anymore? If they're bad, in the past, at least you had Harry. He might say something funny or goofy or whatever that he used to do, and you would be intrigued. And now he's gone, so what happens now? End up loosely following the team early in the season. I don't remember a lot of early games like watching very very closely. The Curry Wood 20 strikeout game, I do remember it being a big deal, but I don't think I was invested in that team yet when it happened. And as a 12-year-old, I don't think I truly understood how great of a game that was. When I started to get invested in the season, I remember a couple things. I remember, first of all, it just seemed like the Cubs were kind of hanging around and playing decent ball. And I don't remember exactly when I was like, this is it, I'm hooked. But I do know by the time it was that June, Sammy Sosa hits 20 home runs. And at that point, I was absolutely hooked. I don't know if it was like following the standings and they're hanging in. I don't know if it's just the intrigue of Sosa hitting 20 home runs in a month, which is absolutely ridiculous. Um, PEDs or not, like nobody else has done that. That's insane. 20 home runs in a month. And I remember also very distinctly that year, there was a lot of hype over if Mark McGwire could break the record, the single season home run record that Roger Maris had. And there were other names also mentioned too, because this was the very, very peak era of home runs. Steroids were running rampant in the game. The pitchers, there was a lot of pitchers who weren't great, who weren't throwing high velocity like they do now. And the reliance on the bullpen just wasn't there. So there was a lot of opportunity for home runs, and a lot of people were hitting them. And there was a lot of emphasis on hitting home runs. And people like to watch to see the moonshots that go 500 feet and the insane home run numbers. People loved it. So there was a lot of intrigue and a lot of thought that this is the year Mark McGwire is going to break Roger Maris's record. There were other names mentioned too. You would see it. So like our newspaper, I remember a local newspaper actually would have on the sports page on the top corner of the page, it would have a home run count, and it would have the pictures of the players who are chasing Maris, and it would say something like chasing Maris or whatever on it, and you would have Mark McGwire was up there like the entire season. But you also had Ken Griffey Jr., you had Barry Bonds. There might even have been a couple other players. Sammy Sosa wasn't really even thought of the first couple months of the season because he didn't get off to the ridiculously hot start that some of these other guys did. But then when June came along and he hit 20 home runs, he was in it. That was it. That was it. He was in the thick of the race for the rest of the year. And for me personally, it was the Cubs playing good baseball, and they already had a few stories between Harry Carey's death and the Kerry Wood game where he struck out 20. And I started to gravitate towards that club because of that 20 home run month. Now I do remember the team, and I think I actually had went to Chicago with my family, not related to baseball. We didn't go to a Cubs game or anything, but I remember reading the newspaper, and they had just played Cleveland in a series, and I think they were in the midst of a losing streak. And I do remember that distinctly, and thinking, oh, well, maybe that early season run, maybe that's not it. Maybe this is the June swoon they always talk about. And this might have been in July even because I might have been completely hyped and hooked because Sammy's home run chase or Sammy's 20 home run month. I remember being like, okay, well they're out of it, but then I also discovered how the wild card worked, and the Cubs were very much still in the thick of the wild card. So they were in the NL Central. The Houston Astros at the time were also in the NL Central. Obviously, they're in the American League now, but the Houston Astros were the division leaders, and they kind of just started to run away with the division. They were very, very good in 1998. That was the year they ended up trading for Randy Johnson from the Seattle Mariners. So Randy Johnson actually pitched for this Astros team at the end of the year. Very, very good ball club. The Cubs never really threatened them for the division, but they hung around the wild card all season. And so the Cubs are playing this very intriguing baseball, very solid baseball. Every game started to matter, especially the later and later you get into the season. I also discovered listening to baseball on the radio. And the reason I did that is because this is around the time I had my parents put an old, or my dad let me put an old TV in my bedroom. Now that didn't mean too much because there wasn't cable or anything hooked up. It was an old antenna. So I didn't really watch too much, but on Saturdays, if there was a baseball game on, I could now watch baseball in my room. But the rest of the time, I was starting to discover my independence and things like that because I was in middle school, and so I was spending a lot of time in my room, kind of just doing my own thing. And I had a radio that I gotten for Christmas, and I started to discover like I don't have to actually go downstairs and turn on the TV, or if my parents are watching TV or my sister's watching TV and I can't watch the Cubs game, I can still listen to the Cubs game. So I started to listen to the radio. Plus, I could do other things. I remember at the time I was really into playing my Game Boy, and I would play my Game Boy a lot in my room, where I would play computer games in our computer room, which was a separate room from the house. But none of these had a TV. So if I wanted to still experience the Cubs, I had to find a way to do it. Now, smartphones didn't exist, so I couldn't scroll my phone and check the score. The internet did exist, but like for checking live baseball scores, it wasn't really that easy to do. Um, I don't even know how easy it would have been in 1998 to check a live baseball score. I honestly don't know. I can't remember. So the primary source would have been the radio. So I spend a lot of time listening to the radio. I would put them on I guess I would put them on while I play my Game Boy or when I would do something else, but it ultimately it wasn't background noise because I was intently listening, but I started to discover the storytelling aspect of the radio. I listened to Pat Hughes, who's a great play-by-play broadcaster, and really paints a picture. Honestly, for me, as a 12-year-old listening to the game was very gripping, and I was like, this is what I want to do. Ron Santo was his color commentator, and even at the time, I didn't think he was that deep of a color commentator, but his passion for the game came through. His passion for the Chicago Cubs came through when he yelled with excitement and got really into it. You know, when Sammy Sosa hit a home run, he would yell with excitement. When the Cubs messed up, I mean, he had the famous Brant Brown clip at the end of the season, infamous clip at the end of the season when Brant Brown drops a fly ball and Ron Santo just screams, "Oh no!" And you could just feel that passion for the team through the radio, even as a 12-year-old. And I was like, this is intriguing. This is something enjoyable to listen to. And then there was like all kinds of wild games with the Milwaukee Brewers that year. That Brant Brown game that I just referenced was against the Brewers. But there's all kinds of like 5, 6, 7 run comebacks against this team, back and forth battles. They, it was just a very memorable season. It was all tied together with Sammy Sosa. And I remember very distinctly too, towards the end of the season when Sammy Sosa was starting to get close to the record with Mark McGwire, and there was actually one point in the season where Sammy Sosa passes Mark McGwire, and I remember that very distinctly. I remember him actually breaking Maris's break. Now he didn't break. McGwire broke Maris's home run record first, but Sammy Sosa getting there was also a big deal, and I actually have the cassette tape that are recorded off the radio when it happened. So I could pop if I have a cassette player, which I don't. I could pop that audio in and listen to it whenever I wanted. And this is from 1998. It's 2024 now. I do believe I still have those tapes in my closet somewhere. So that moment was very obviously very important. But as things go along, I remember just very getting very connected with this team, and so much of it was through that home run chase. So much of it was through the radio. So much of it was through that. And it all kind of culminated with the Cubs getting to the 1 game playoff for the wild card. Now, the end of the season, as I mentioned, they played the Milwaukee Brewers in Milwaukee. Now, the Milwaukee Brewers are not a good team at the time. Like, they're an okay team. I think they were like a 500 team, but they're not what they are now, where they're consistently at the top of the NL Central. But like I said, the Cubs and the Brewers just had these wacky games all season long where it was huge comebacks both ways, walk-off hits, walk-off home runs, just all kinds of crazy stuff between the two teams. And in this series, the Cubs looked like their season pretty much had ended when they led a game late. I believe it was like 4 games left in the season, because they had to go to Houston to finish the season, and Houston was really good, and playing in the Astrodome was not an enjoyable task. And they were chasing the entire season. They're actually the Mets are the team that they were battling for the wild card, and the San Francisco Giants were kind of there, but they were kind of just hanging around. But it was always it's between the Cubs and the Mets, and the whole season it was scoreboard watching the Mets and hoping they lose and hoping your team wins, and it was just absolutely gripping baseball that I absolutely loved. But it was also horrifying for somebody who had never followed a team like that before. But they go into Milwaukee and they look like they're going to get a series win or get a big win, and a pop flies hit to left field. Looks like it's going to be the final out, and Brant Brown, the left fielder, drops the ball. 2-run score. The Cubs end up losing, and now it looks like they have to go to Houston and win some games. And it's not going to be an easy task. And they actually, I believe, they won one of 3 games in Houston in the season. But what happened was they played uh, actually, what ends up happening is the Giants actually overtake the Mets as the team the Cubs are chasing right at the end of the season. And it looks like the Giants are actually going to pass the Cubs and win the wild card, and the Cubs are going to lose it on the last game of the year, which would have absolutely been heartbreaking. I don't know how I would have handled that, considering it was my first year following the team. But what happens is, I believe the Rockies come back from a huge deficit to beat the Giants. Neifi Perez hits a walk-off home run. I remember that distinctly because I remember the highlight. They showed it during one of the Cubs game. Neifi Perez hits a walk-off home run. I think the Giants were up like 7 or 8 runs in this game. And Neifi Perez, who's a future maligned Cub in the mid 2000s, but at the time he was a hero to the Cubs because without that walk-off home run, the Giants win the wild card. The Cubs don't even see the playoffs. What happens is they end the season tied. So after 162 games, the Cubs and the Giants are tied, and they play a one-game wild card tiebreaker at Wrigley Field. That was the first time that I remember feeling palpable tension in the crowd, or not in the crowd, but just tension from watching a baseball game. Like I remember watching the Yankees against the Braves in 1996. I never felt that tension. Plus, the Yankees won in 6 games. The game 7 between the Marlins and Cleveland, I did feel a little bit of nerves because I really wanted the Florida Marlins to win, but it didn't feel like if the Marlins had lost, it would have wrecked me. This one game playoff, I remember very distinctly telling my dad how nervous I was. I remember turning the radio on to listen to the pregame show, and I just remember just being anxious. It was really the first time, honestly, I don't know if it's the first time I was anxious for a sporting event because, like I said, I liked football, I liked other sports, and I had favorite teams, but baseball was different. I never felt like this for a baseball game. I never felt that tension, and you just didn't know how that game was going to go. And then as you're watching it, the Cubs end up winning. I wouldn't say easily, but it ends up being not a comfortable win, but the Cubs end up they lead the whole game, and then actually the game does come down to Joe Carter at the plate. He's the man who hit the home run in the 1993 World Series to win the World Series, and he comes to the plate. And I remember very distinctly thinking, like, oh, this is the guy. We got to get this guy out to go to the playoffs. Joe Carter, the guy who hit the home run in 1993, which I was aware of at the time. Um, but he pops up. The Cubs catch the ball. They go to the playoffs. So I remember being super excited. I remember wanting to listen to the post game show on the radio, which was in the same not the same room because my parents' bedroom was connected to the, I guess you could call it a living room, but it was in the basement. And I was ready. I turned on the post game show. I'm all excited. I think my dad probably heard me yelling in excitement or something. He came out, immediately told me I have to go to bed. Like, I cannot listen to the post game show. I don't care how excited you are. It's time for bed. It's school night. So I couldn't listen to the excitement of the post game show and all that stuff. But I do remember it being very, very hard to go to sleep. I know they were going to play the Atlanta Braves in the playoffs. And I knew it was going to be very, very challenging because the Braves were really, really good in 1998. They were good in every season of the 90s. They were the team in the 90s in the National League. I was like, whoa, the Cubs are playing the Braves. And I remember listening to those playoff. I remember listening to the first playoff game. I went out in my backyard and played wiffle ball, and the Braves won pretty comfortably. I think that's why I didn't want to watch it, is because the Braves took the lead early, and I was just like, this is not going to go well. Game two, I remember being in Atlanta, and this is probably the first time as a Cub fan that my heart was broken. Very distinctly remember the Cubs holding a lead, one run lead till very very late in the game, and the Cubs end up losing it on a walk off late in the game. And I remember being like, "That's it. They're down 2-0. They're going back to Wrigley." At the time, a 2-0 lead in a best of five to me felt completely tough to overcome, especially because the Braves were really, really good and the Cubs were underdogs. We knew that, like, the Cubs felt like an underdog. And they do go back to Wrigley, and Kerry Wood actually pitches. I know he was injured for the end of the season, and that was honestly kind of a common thing with Kerry Wood's career was injuries. And the Braves win pretty handily, and they end up sweeping the series. But I remember at the end of that series being like, "This is awesome! Like this is the first year we're in the playoffs. We made the playoffs as the up and coming team. Now we're just gonna build on it and going forward. The Cubs next year, like next year, they'll win a playoff round, and maybe in 2 years they'll get to the World Series, and in 3 years they'll win the World Series." I was naive. I didn't understand that being a Cubs fan meant pain. It meant that you're gonna at some point experience heartbreak. Now I didn't experience the real heartbreak. Now the 2001 season I did experience it a little bit as the team kind of overachieved but then collapsed. But that team mostly overachieved and they never really expected to be in a position to win the division. So that wasn't extreme heartbreak. It was disappointing, but it wasn't like this hurts. 2003 is when I really felt the first painful experience of being a Cubs fan. The whole Steve Bartman thing, blowing a 3-1 series lead. That was the first time when I really was like, okay, this is what it's about. Um, but at that time, I was completely hooked and in love with the club. So all that's to say is the 1998 team is the reason that I love the Chicago Cubs. And the biggest person on that club is Sammy Sosa. So Sammy Sosa always been, I would say, I won't go so far as to say a controversial figure in Chicago. I think he was a target. He was definitely a target for like White Sox fans because there was a time when like I feel like the Cubs and the White Sox in late 90s, early 2000s was a rivalry. It felt like these two teams do not like each other. I don't care they're in other leagues. These fans hate each other. I remember Cubs and White Sox fans just being at each other's throats. I remember talking, getting crap talked to by White Sox fans, going back and forth, that sort of thing. And Sammy Sosa, having had played for the White Sox and getting traded to the Cubs, and now was the big figure. And to be honest, there was a time when I would say Sammy Sosa was almost the figure that like Michael Jordan was in the city of Chicago. Now, granted, I wasn't from Chicago, so I didn't have the pulse of the city, but as somebody who followed Chicago sports, Sammy Sosa was that big of a figure. So, and it makes sense. He hit 60 home runs 3 different seasons. Like he was the big time face of the team. Like I remember very distinctly his different things that he would do. Like I remember imitating his batting stance. I remember imitating his hop when he hit a home run. I was left-handed, by the way. He was right-handed, but I would go to the right-handed batter's box so I could imitate Sammy Sosa, so I could do the hop when he hits a home run. I could do his little blowing kisses things that he used to do. Let me try to do it. Something like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm not as good as I don't remember that well. It was 25 years ago, but I used to do all that stuff. Like Sammy Sosa was the guy, and he was the face of the Cubs for so long. Like he was a big deal, and he would be the target from other teams. I remember first like exploring like message board forums and stuff online to try to follow baseball, and the trolls on there would always target Sammy Sosa, and I would get so angry because I'm like, that's our guy. Like Sammy Sosa's our guy. Sorry, I keep looking at this like it's on camera. This is a Beanie Baby, or it's a fake Beanie Baby. My sister got me many years ago of Sammy Sosa. So I just had it out just in case, and I'm staring at it with no context, which, whatever. Anyways, that's why I was looking over there. But and that just kind of shows the go. Like he's the guy. He merchandise. with any player on it, it's Sammy Sosa. So he was the target from everybody, but at the time it was just like, well, you're just jealous of him. And like, what else are you gonna do? The guy loves to have fun. The guy does like cool things are exciting to watch. The guy hits bombs for home runs. The guy hits a bunch of home runs. The guy's an perennial all star. Like all this stuff. It was complete jealousy. That's what it felt like. And for so long, like as a Cub fan, I'm like Sammy Sosa is I'm not gonna say he's Ernie Banks and Mr. Cub, but he was our Mr. Cub. Like you would watch Cubs games to watch Sammy Sosa, even in those years that were bad. Like I mentioned, 2001 and 1998, they were good, and then 2003 they were good and made the playoffs. But honestly, Sosa wasn't the same in 2003 as he was the previous years. But even those years he was bad in 99, 2000, 2002, when the Cubs were bad, Sammy Sosa was still amazing. And you would watch Cubs games just to see how many home runs Sammy Sosa would hit. So he was such a major part of the franchise. You get a little bit later, 2003 is when it starts to go downhill when he quirks the bat or when they're playing the Tampa Bay Rays, they're the Devil Rays at the time. Sammy Sosa bat shatters on the field, and I remember very distinctly watching this game. The bat shatters, middle of the field, and all of a sudden they're looking at it, looking at the bat. Sammy Sosa called out, ejected from the game because he quirked his bat. And I remember being a fan at the time, being like, that is blatant cheating. The guy that I've been watching and rooting for many, many years just got caught cheating. And the steroid stuff, I think, was starting to be rumblings at the time. It wasn't like to the extreme that it is in a few years later, but steroids in baseball starting to come out. The accusations are starting to go, but you get a little defensive of the guys you like. You're getting a little defensive of the players because you're like, no, they're not using the steroids. Like, this is just a thing that's being said. Guys are like working really hard in the gym. They're just really muscular. Like that's all it is. Like there's no steroids in the game. Like it's not that. Like you guys are just coming up with excuses to kind of downplay all these home runs. These old riders, they're too connected to their plays from the 50s and 60s. Like that's not what's happening here. But then that happens and you're starting to be like, "Oh no, like maybe the guy that I've been rooting for so long isn't very pure." And then like later on, like Sammy's getting booed when he's going to other parks. Before he used to get cheered. I remember the 1998 playoff or not the 1998 season. Whenever Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire stepped up to the plate, it didn't matter what park it was. They were getting standing ovations. Flashbulbs are going up. People were rooting for them to homer against their team because they wanted to see it. They were beloved figures. Sammy Sosa was very beloved because the way he interacted with the media, the way he was fun to watch, the way his whole personality was like electric and very vibrant, and people loved him. And then in 2003, when the cork bat incident happens, now it's starting to be like, okay, your heroes are flawed. Your heroes are not the people that you always think they are. And now it starts to creep in your mind. Maybe he did use roids. Maybe this did happen, which is it was disappointing. And I think that's at the point for myself when I'm like, maybe he isn't my all-time favorite player, and he's not my all-time favorite Cub. I like in retrospect, I did kind of reconcile with some of the stuff, and I do put him up there as one of my all-time favorite Cubs because he's ultimately a major responsibility behind me being a fan of this team. But there's still elements like that where I'm like, it wasn't as pure as I wanted it to be. So there was times when it was like, I am disappointed in the cork bat incident. And then if he did use PEDs, now granted, nothing concrete had ever come out, but I remember being like, well, if he did do that, maybe my guy's not as pure as I'd like. Um, then in 2004, at the end of the season, and 2004 was a really, really frustrating season where the Cubs were pretty good for most of the season, and then they collapse at the end. While at the same time, the St. Louis Cardinals are very, very good, and they end up running away with the Central Division. And then the Cubs, who look like they're going to win the wild card, collapse at the end of the season, don't make the playoffs at all. And it all ends with the final game with Sammy Sosa leaving the game early, just leaving the team early. And it angered A lot of people supposedly, I I've heard different rumors about who was mad about it. I guess it doesn't matter. I mean, as a teammate, if you see your like your teammate leave early and he's your superstar and he has a reputation, you're going to be disappointed by that. And then there's rumors of Sammy's boombox getting hit with a baseball bat and shattered, and just all these bad things happening. And that was kind of the end of Sammy Sosa being recognized in the Cubs franchise, which was 20 years ago, 2004. And I at the time, the 2004 Cubs really, really frustrated me as a fan. I'm 18, like I'm starting to transition to adulthood, and this team just felt like a bunch of underachievers. They were frustrating. It felt like there was a lot of whining with the team in general, not just Sammy Sosa, but like when you already had the corked bat incident from the year earlier, and now the steroid stuff's starting to come out more and more. The Cubs are expected to be very, very good in 2004, and it seemed like they were for most of the season. They made a big trade for Nomar Garciaparra, where it looked like, okay, this is going to push us to the next level, and it just never comes to be. It was very disappointing. It was a very tough end, and then Sammy Sosa leaves the team, and then at the time I was following Cubs baseball. Like I was eating up message boards, I was eating up sports talk radio. I was just everything that I could get with the Cubs, and everything was negative, and it was all a lot of blame was placed on Sosa um, for that. And then when he left the team, of course, there's a lot of vitriol spewed to him, and I couldn't. I felt like I couldn't defend him anymore. I'm like that's just a thing you do. You abandon your team, you leave your team just hanging, and that was it. And then like as more time passes, Sammy Sosa ultimately gets traded to the Baltimore Orioles. Sorry, I actually paused the video, so I'm gonna have to put this together. But I remember being like, okay, this is the moment that he kind of started to come back. I think to myself, endearing myself a little bit. And then he ultimately, I think he retired at the end of the '07 season, maybe '08. I can't remember exactly when. Um, and I had started to follow the Cubs teams and fell in love with the 2008 Cubs, who were one of my all-time favorite Cubs teams. And there's other players and connections there. And Sammy was kind of he was gone. He was gone from the mind of the Cubs. And then a couple years later, the new ownership takes over, Tom Ricketts, and there was a lot more evidence of people being more accepting of the old players who did use steroids. And there was a bit of openness to it. Like eventually, Barry Bonds becomes a hitting coach. Mark McGwire is welcomed back by the St. Louis Cardinals. I think he became a hitting coach too. And there was a welcomeness to these guys who use steroids, who you look like were being pushed out of the game. All these writers basically said they're never going to vote for him in the Hall of Fame. But now there's this like openness to welcome him back to baseball. But Sammy Sosa never gets that openness. So for years as Cubs fans were like, are we going to welcome him with open arms? Because I think a lot of Cubs fans started to find that place of forgiveness where they're seeing this happening in baseball, where all these other alleged or very proven steroid users are coming back into the game and they're being welcomed. And nowadays, many people want them in the Hall of Fame. Like they don't want the writers to be punishing them forever. And I agree too. Like I don't want to see my era of baseball completely blackballed and banished. I don't personally want to see it. I think Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame. I want to see Mark McGwire in the Hall of Fame. I want to see Sammy Sosa, Alex Rodriguez. I want to see these guys in the Hall. I understand the steroid accusations. I understand what happened. But at the end of the day, I just don't want to see the memories that they created ignored. And as I started to have this viewpoint more and more, I started to really dig into Sammy Sosa, especially. Um, I was kind of hoping I could clear his name from the accusations. That just doesn't seem like it could be done. I don't think his name could have been cleared, but that's when I came to the conclusion that of what I said earlier, where I do think he did them in a way that was a legal loophole. He I don't know for sure, but like the fact of the matter is the rules against steroids for so long were so vague that I don't think it's fair to completely punish the players for doing it. And that's when I started to recognize, like, Sammy. That's when I started to forgive. That's when I started to be like, okay, Sammy Sosa is one of my all-time favorite Cubs. He is on that list. He is not number one to me, but honestly, I only think that's because he didn't win a World Series. Like guys like Anthony Rizzo and Chris Bryant, they won a friggin' World Series, so of course I'm gonna gravitate towards those guys. If Sammy Sosa had won the World Series in 2003, maybe he is still on that list for me. Maybe he's back to number one. But at the same time, like I'm very, very openly being like, oh yeah, Sammy Sosa's my guy. I love Sammy Sosa. And this apology that he just gave, I think it just brings everything full circle. It's like time to finally look at what he did before things started to go downhill and look at that in a positive light again. Look at how the home run chase, what it did for the sport of baseball. I don't think regular season baseball has been watched that intently since. And that was 25 years ago. And people were glued to their TVs just to see what McGuire and Sammy would do every single day. And I can't think of an experience with baseball, and honestly any other regular season sport, that matches what that was like. What Sammy did, hitting 60 home runs every single year, the way he put the Chicago Cubs on his back, especially in seasons like 2001, but in 1998 too, and just literally carried the offense, took very competitive seasons, and one year to the playoffs, another year, I would say 5 out of 6 months to a division title. Like the team was the best team in the NL Central for most of the season. And the way he did it in a theatrical way, like he was entertaining to watch. He had like an aura to himself. Like he wasn't just a great ball player. It was the way he did things on the field, the flair that he used. It was he had a very specific way of doing it and he was entertaining and he was a great ball player and I'm happy to see the Cubs finally mending with him, and it's going to be fantastic when he finally. I don't know if it's going to come out for first pitch. I don't know if he's just going to step out the dugout, wave to the crowd. Whatever it is, when Sammy Sosa appears, it's going to be great. Maybe he'll run to right field. I don't know if he can do that anymore. I hope he can. That would be awesome. But whatever it is, I'm very, very happy that the Cubs and Sammy Sosa kind of made this reconcile. This video went on longer than I really expected it to be, although um, something happened where I bumped the keyboard halfway through. I'll probably fix that. But I just I just feel like I had to talk about how I became a Cubs fan to really really explain how impactful Sammy Sosa as a ball player was to me and why him reconciling with the franchise is such a big deal. Um, so if you did listen to it, I thank you very much. I do want to do more of these sort of commentaries when the subject matter is acceptable to do it. I think my number one favorite thing to do talk about is sports is my fan experience. I think that's just what I've always enjoyed. I enjoy reading about that from other people. That's why I used to go to forums. That's why I've read stuff on different social media platforms, just talking about what it's like to be a fan, how you became a fan, all that stuff, and what it feels like. And so I thought this was just a perfect moment to bring that to fruition. So thank you if you listen to that. Other than that, have a good night.